Start now. So welcome to today's webinar, which is part of the Young Scholar webinar series on climate change, macroeconomics and finance, organized by the E-Axis Forum. I'm Connor Walsh. I'm an assistant professor at Columbia Business School. And today we have Keith Chan and Wilson Wan will present their paper, The Double-Edged Sword of Firms' Commitments to Net Zero on the Carbon Risk Premium. This paper was awarded an honorable mention for the 2024 E-Axis Forum Research Prize. Now, so Keith Jin Deng Chan is an assistant professor in the Division of Environment and Sustainability at the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology. He specializes in applying economic and game theory to study the optimal design of governance mechanisms. He's currently a member of China Technical Expert Group under the IPSF Taxonomy Working Group. His research has also informed the Hong Kong Monetary Authority in formulating the Hong Kong Taxonomy for Sustainable Finance. Keith holds a PhD in economics from the University of Cambridge. Wilson Shing Wan is a PhD candidate in the Division of Environment and Sustainability at HKUST. He specializes in applying empirical methods to study the financial instability implications of climate finance. Wilson is also currently working in the Banking Supervision Department of the Hong Kong Monetary Authority. He holds an MPhil in economics from HKUST. So just a reminder, we'll have time for questions after the presentation. We'll take about 43 minutes from this point. To ask questions, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. Enjoy the talk. Keith and Wilson, take it away.
Thank you so much, Connor, for the introduction. So we're very honored to have this opportunity to present our research at this webinar. So to start off, our research focuses on the idea of carbon risk. So in recent years, carbon risk has become an increasingly important risk factor in the equity market. So there are various channels where greenhouse gas emissions of companies affect their stock return. Okay, so the first two channels, which are pretty well known from TCFD, is regulatory risk, the fact that government policies could affect the stock price of a company because they present regulatory risk to the company. And it could also represent a change in the consumer demand away from companies that are carbon intensive. So very well documented in the literature is the potential increase in the funding cost. Okay, so it can come from the increase in the funding cost through equity, but also through loans. Okay, and finally, when a company has a high emission intensity, it also translates to future abatement cost, which the investor can potentially get concerned about. So in response to the concern for carbon risk, there's an increasing demand for companies to make forward-looking disclosure. So this is not just coming from the market pressure. We can see a lot of initiatives like ISSB is making companies to disclose their future climate risk and opportunities. Okay, so increasingly companies are making these net zero commitments in line with the disclosure expectation of the market. So the focus of our research is to further the understanding of carbon risk premium, which is the compensation that investors demand for the carbon risk, by looking at how this net zero commitment can influence the premium. And we also want to study the determinants of the impact. Okay, so we make three contributions to the topic. The first one is we illustrate a very rich set of effects coming from net zero commitment and how it affects the carbon risk premium. The second one is we look at the pricing channel. In particular, we study how investors, institutional investors particularly, play a role in pricing the carbon risk. And finally, we explore the financial stability implications of our research. So here's an overview of our key findings. So we find that on average, if we just look at the entire sample, we'll talk about the sample later in the presentation, net zero commitment does not have any significant impact on carbon risk premium. However, that will be obscuring some of the underlying channels that we uncover in the subsample analysis. In particular, we find that the impact varies with the firm's transition readiness. So what is that transition readiness? So basically, we break down the institutional factors into three different factors. The first one concerns transition capacity, which is how cost effective is it for a company to abate the greenhouse gas emissions? And we understand that it has a lot to do with the environmental constraint. For example, the energy mix that the company is using is largely constraining how fast and how effective it can abate the emission. The second one has to do with the policy aspect. We call that the transition urgency. Basically, this is the external pressure that is imposed on the company to abate the emissions. And finally, we look at the decision horizon, which is whether the company is driven to focus more on the short term or the long term. Okay. So with that, we dive into the subsample analysis. We find that the impact of net zero commitment on carbon risk premium is pretty diverse, depending on these institutional characteristics. Okay, so if a company has a very low transition capacity, low transition urgency, or they focus on the short term, then declaring this net zero commitment is going to increase their carbon risk premium. Okay, but if they have a high transition readiness, as illustrated on the right-hand side of the table, then declaring net zero is actually going to decrease the carbon risk premium. So we also find a channel that is pretty important in driving the results. We find that institutional investors are largely responsible for the existence of carbon risk premium. We find that institutional investors tend to divest from stocks of companies with high emission intensity, but they also divest more if these high emitting companies have declared net zero commitment. Okay. So with that introduction, we go into the literature review to position our paper. The first branch of literature is the association between stock returns and the climate risk exposure of a firm. Okay, so in the literature, it has been repeatedly documented that carbon risk is a significant factor that has an impact on the stock return. So we have got these nice papers by Bolton and Kapachek documenting carbon risk premium, but they are not the only one doing it. So we have got a few papers that try to examine this relationship empirically. So the last two papers that we are putting there are like examining or proposing some potential channels. So I want to focus your attention on the 2021 paper JFE, which looked at the hypothesis that the fact that green assets may have lower expected returns is driven by the investor's green preference. Okay, so as you'll see, we're going to differentiate our theoretical framework from this green preference explanation. We want to provide another angle to understand the phenomenon. Okay, so the second strand of literature that is related to our paper is on green commitment. Okay, so the first paper, I think is still a working paper by Bolton and Kapachek, is looking at the firm commitments, and they find that only companies making the most ambitious emissions reduction targets tend to have lower emissions. Okay, so there are also papers that are studying how this green commitment affects the stock return. And I'll say that at this moment, the evidence is pretty mixed. Okay, so the Peterson's paper in Journal of Sustainable Finance and Investment does not find any statistically significant relationship. Liu's et al. Paper at Financial Research Letter shows that green commitment can reduce the stock price crash risk. Okay, so as a result, it's a positive thing for the stock price. However, there's another paper from Xie et al., which shows that actually this green commitment may negatively affect the stock price of the green companies, looking at the sample of listed firms in the UK and the US. So the last strand of literature that we study is on climate-related investment strategies, and I think there we have like a relative consensus on the climate reinvestment strategies. Papers find that institutional investors tend to be more willing to hold stocks of companies that are socially responsible, and they tend to divest from firms with a higher emissions intensity. Okay, so this is also something that we'll address at the second part of the presentation. Okay, so with this overall review, now we'll focus on the theoretical framework, which is going to guide the like empirical analysis we'll perform later. Okay, so as I say, a very important contrast we're trying to make is how we explained the pricing phenomenon of green assets. So some existing studies, they predict green assets have lower expected returns because investors have stronger green preference. They like these assets, and that's why they're willing to accept a lower return. Okay, so we actually try to move away from the green preference hypothesis and try to focus on the financial materiality of carbon risk. And you're going to see that, well, financial materiality of carbon risk has a lot to do with transition capacity, transition urgency, and also the decision horizon we just talked about at the beginning of the talk. Okay, so we want to understand how this is going to affect the enterprise value, which is defined as the net present value of the future net profit flow. Okay, so this is a framework that is adopted from a previous paper that we work on with some modifications. So it turns out that if we move away from the green preference hypothesis and look at the financial materiality explanation, we can make richer prediction and we can capture more diverse pricing phenomenon, as you can see in the empirical estimation section. So now I'm going to present the key elements of the model. This is a continuous time model. A single firm is making a decision. We're going to focus on this particular firm. So X of t is the greenhouse gas intensity of the firm at time t, and the status quo emission or the current emission is called X naught. Okay, it's a positive. We also write down the gross profit of the firm at time t, which is something that is before we account for the carbon risk and the abatement cost. Okay, we have a parameter here capturing one of the first important institutional factors called transition urgency, and this beta parameter will be translated in the dollar value of carbon risk, which is a beta times X. Okay, so of course it's proportional to the emission intensity of the company, but also this paper is showing you how important is that emission intensity of the company. Okay, so I want to emphasize that this beta does not only represent carbon price. Of course, if there's a carbon price facing the firm, then the company has to pay for the emissions. But this beta is actually encompassing broader climate risk, for example, the market risk that we talked about at the beginning of the talk. So with this dollar value of transition risk, the company can actually do something to reduce it. Okay, so the company can choose to decarbonize the value chain. So here we use the notation U of t to represent the decarbonization rate of the company at time t. Okay, so we assume that this U of t is non-negative to rule the possibility of recarbonization. So of course, we do that for simplicity. If we don't do it, then potentially some company would want to increase their emission in the short run, even after they have made the net zero commitment. Okay, so there's nothing precluding them from doing that, so they can increase it in the short run and then go back to reach the emission target in the long run. So here, importantly, with the second institutional factor captured by kappa. Kappa is the transition capacity of the company as perceived by the investor. Okay, so the way that kappa features in the decision is that it affects the abatement cost. Okay, so the abatement cost here is inversely proportional to kappa, and of course it has to it's convex in the decarbonization rate to reflect the diminishing marginal returns. So the more ambitious the company want to decarbonize at a particular time, the more marginal cost it has to face. Okay. So finally, we try to imitate the existing institutional context. When many people talk about net zero, there's actually a deadline. Okay, so there's a deadline for low carbon transition. Okay, in the model, we assume that the firm is endowed with 1 unit of time to decarbonize. In order to make this deadline analytically meaningful, we assume that this U of t is set to be 0 after the deadline, like t equals to 1. Okay, so at that time, there's a parameter called X1, which is the emissions target as perceived by the investor. So of course, we found a more meaningful way to capture this X1 because how ambitious X1 is depends on the current emission. So instead of looking at X1 alone, we try to normalize it and define the parameter called phi, which is equal to 1 minus X1 over X naught. Okay, so you can see that when phi equals to 0, it means that the company has not done any decarbonization at all, so X1 equals to X0. But if X1 is equal to 1, it means that the company is totally fulfilling the net zero commitment such that at time equals to 1, the emission intensity becomes 0. Okay, so we are using this to capture transition ambition. And the relationship with net zero commitment is that when a company makes net zero commitment, it's actually communicating to the investors of its climate ambition. So we're trying to do this comparative statistics with regard to phi later on in the model. So with all these different elements defined together, we will put it together into the net profit function. So the net profit function here consists of several elements. Apart from the gross profit, of course, we have the transition risk, which is a function of the emission intensity and also the transition urgency parameter. Okay, we also have the abatement cost parameter here, which is inversely proportional to the transition capacity and also the how much the company wants to decarbonize at a particular time. Okay, so with that, we go and look at the investor's decision. Okay, so how investor perceive the enterprise value of the company. So of course, investor do not just look at the instantaneous time; they look at the net present value of the company, as written in the usual formula. We have this like discount rate called R, measuring the decision horizon of the how much you discount the net present value. Okay, so to focus on the effect of the parameter, of course, we see that there's so many different ways that the enterprise value of the company can turn out, depending on the transition plan. Okay, in order to focus on the effects of the parameters, we assume that the investor evaluate the enterprise value looking at the optimal transition pathway, which means that before we can derive the enterprise value, we have to solve a optimization problem using optimal control theory to see what is the optimal transition pathway of the company given the parameters it's facing. Okay, so of course, there's some usual constraint of the optimization problem at the bottom line here. So we have to fulfill the usual definition of U of t equals to the negative decarbonization rate, x dot, with the initial condition, x of 0 equals to x naught, and also x of 1 equals to what the transition ambition entails. Okay, so with this optimized enterprise value, we can go on to investigate how carbon risk premium play a role in the enterprise value. Okay, so here we're going to present the results. To understand this aspect, of course, the first part of the solution is to solve for the optimal transition pathway of the company. Okay, so we can define a function here, which is for technical purpose, we don't go into too much details. And we can find out that there's a variable called tau, which is capturing the time when the company stopped the decarbonization because it has already reached the transition target it set for itself. Okay, so here this tau parameter is actually helping us to categorize companies into two different types. Some of the companies, they will actually stop early, potentially because their target is not ambitious enough. So that tau is less than 1, depending on some parameters here. So we have a characterization at the bottom line here of the proposition. So some companies, they will actually take all the time before the deadline to do the decarbonization. Okay, so we have two different types of companies. So we first look at the company that I think will be more usual and more common, which is that they'll take all the time they need before the decarbonization deadline to do the transition. So if you look at the condition we specify here, you can see that already transition capacity and urgency, they play a role for companies that choose this particular transition pathway. So for these companies that are like they spend all the time to do the decarbonization, we find that, well, not surprisingly, the carbon risk premium is always positive in the sense that if they have a higher status quo emission X naught, it's going to negatively affect the enterprise value. Okay. Second proposition is to look at what is the effect of declaring a commitment to net zero. Okay, so as we say, a commitment to net zero is kind of like a communication device of the transition ambition phi. So we do the comparative statistics with respect to phi. Okay, and we find that actually here we already see some ambiguity. So declaring net zero is going to increase the enterprise value of the company if and only if the transition capacity and the urgency of the company is sufficiently high in relation to the ambition. Okay, so we have this like condition inequality here at the right hand side. And finally, this is the statement of our interest. How is net zero commitment going to affect the carbon risk premium of the company? So to do that, we have to do the cross partial derivative here. And we find that actually the answer is also ambiguous. Okay, it's going to raise the company's carbon risk premium if and only if, again, the transition capacity and urgency are sufficiently low relative to the transition ambition. Okay, so we have a lot of ambiguity going on here, which is going to show you the importance of the subsample analysis. So for completeness, we also studied the company that decarbonizing, they stopped decarbonization too early before the deadline. So tau is less than 1. Okay, so we have a similar proposition here qualitatively, except for statement number 2. Because for these companies, it turns out that maybe they stopped decarbonization too early due to their insufficiently ambitious transition target. That's why if you declare commitment to net zero, you can actually increase the optimized enterprise value, okay, because you are not ambitious enough. So showing investor that you are more ambitious can actually raise the enterprise value. So that's the only difference, qualitatively different from proposition number 2 for this type of companies. So to give you a summary of the framework, we are using a framework to pull together a lot of parameters. So we repeatedly see the moderating role of this expression here. Okay, so this is like a ratio consisting of 5 different parameters. Some of them are inherent to the firm, the current emission intensity, and also the ambition of transition. Okay, so the X0 and the phi. But there are also some other parameters that like determining whether declaring net zero is good or bad for carbon risk premium. So they are respectively transition urgency, transition capacity, and the decision horizon as represented by the discount rate. So with that, in the empirical analysis part, we are going to look at the subsample analysis and try to use these 3 institutional factors to analyze how we will have a differential effect of like net zero commitment on carbon risk premium. So I'm going to pass the time now to Wilson.
Okay, thanks, Keith. I will continue with the empirical estimation part. First, I will talk about the data and samples. Being our the most important variables, net zero commitment, we basically source the data from SBTI. So SBTI is a leading corporate, so it helps the corporates to talk about what is the best practice, and they also collect a data dashboard to collect information on whether the firms has committed net zero commitment or not. So by the end of 2022, there are almost 950 firms they have set the net zero target from the SBTI. To supplement with the SBTI, we also source the data from Capital IQ. Capital IQ provides a comprehensive coverage of firm publication with all the annual reports and all the financial statements. And many firms use the terms net zero, similar terms to net zero, for example, carbon neutrality, climate positive, and we look for these terms when these appear in the public publications, and we will say, once the firms has declared these terms, they have declared net zero. So our final sample consists of SBTI and Capital IQ. They have about 1,177 firms. This represents about more than half of the total market cap of the world as of that date. And for empirical estimation, we define a dummy variable, DITNZ. This will be equal to 1 when the firm's I has declared net zero commitment at the time T. So these are the cumulative density functions in our sample of the firms who have declared net zero by the end of December 2022. So as from the left-hand side, it could be seen that most of the firms have declared net zero in 2019 to 2021, and very few of them declared net zero before that. And figure 2 represents the geographical breakdown of firms by the location of the parent. So it can be seen that European firms are usually the leaders. and the US and other firms are actually the laggards of the net zero commitments. And after introducing the variable net zero commitments, other variables include the firm level emissions. So following the literatures, we sourced the firm level emission from TrueCost. TrueCost again is provide a very rich information about firm level GHG emissions. So there are 3 scopes of GHG emissions: Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3, standing for the direct emissions, the emission from the electricity, and the emission in the value chain. Many papers just use Scope 1 and Scope 2 to gauge the emission of firms because Scope 3, there's lots of data gap issues. There may be double counting or misreporting. But Scope 3 actually is the most important compared to the size of Scope 1 and Scope 2, given that the coverage is the widest. So to have a better picture to gauge the company total emissions, we add these 3 scopes up to gauge the total emissions. And for the main analysis, we will focus on GHG intensity. That is the GHG emission scale by the revenue of the firms. This is because for the 2 reasons. First, in the academic literatures, GHG intensity is actually a better proxies for different industries comparisons. And in the industry also, many financial intermediaries use GHG intensities to implement their climate investments. So we will use GHG intensities in our main focus. And for other data, we have the stock returns because we have to estimate the carbon risk premium. We'll use the monthly stock returns from Bloomberg. It is computed by the log difference in the stock price. And for the institutional ownership, again, it's sourced from Bloomberg. It represents the percentage of shares owned by the institutional investors. And for other control variable, we source from different data sources, including Capital IQ and Bloomberg. So I'm not going in the details, but we will include all the control variable that what the literature are using. And when the literature use it, we will use it. So this includes size, book to market ratio, leverage, so on and so forth. And for our subsample analysis, first to measure the transition capacity we source from the RO in data. So to repeat, transition capacity measure whether a firm can reduce GHG in a cost-effective way. If it can use a low cost to abase the GHG, it means the firm has a high capacity. So vice versa. We measure the transition capacity based on the country level energy use per capita and the share of renewable electricity outputs of the firms located. So a country level energy use is basically adding up all the firms in that country. So this represents the energy efficiency of the firms. And for the share of renewable electricity, it can represent a technological know-how of the firms. So if the firm is located in a country with higher share of renewable electricity, we can assume that the firms there have a better technologies, so it has a higher transition capacity. For the transition urgencies, so again to repeat, it measures the pressure facing by the firms in reducing GHG. So this pressure can come from everywhere, but we use the pressure from the government. We source from the Yale data set and the data from the RO in data. So we have 2 proxies. We have 2 measures of transition urgency. One is the CO2 emission per unit of GDP due to policies, and the other one is the share of GHG emission covered by the country carbon pricing policies. So the first measure, CO2 emission per unit of GDP due to policy, is actually a policy-driven trend of CO2 emissions. So this is the trend of CO2 emissions after taking into account of the business cycle. So this solely measures the country's CO2 emissions based on the country's climate policies. So if a country have a more stringent climate policies, this CO2 emission intensity would be smaller. And the second measure is the share of GHG emissions covered by a carbon price. Many countries, they will impose carbon price to control the GHG emissions in the economy, but they won't introduce the carbon price across all the economic sectors. But if the government is more stringent, they are more ambitious, they will introduce a carbon price that can cover a wider range of economic sector. So we will include this to measure the transition urgency facing by the firms. And to measure the decision horizons, so we source from Capital IQ and the LSEG. So this is formally the Refinitiv. So decision horizons, it is directly related to the valuation of investor whether they value more the long run performance versus the short-term profit. So we measure by the firm's environmental pillar score in the ESG score, and whether the firm there's a golden parachutes in the firm structures. So for environmental pillar scores, there are literature saying that firms have a high E score. This can attract more longer-term investors because they value the long-term performance. And for the existence of golden parachutes, so literature has shown that if the firms has the golden parachutes, the executive or the board of directors, they will focus more on the short-term performance because they can get a huge profit if they can shortly increase the firm value. And so that's why if the firm has a golden parachutes, it will encourage a short-termism of the board. In turn, it can attract the short-term investors. So these are the summary statistics, the GHG emission and the intensity. So it could be seen as that no matter Scope 3 emissions or the emission intensities, the mean or the median are the highest. So it shows that Scope 3 emissions is actually the most important. And dummy net zero is the median is 0. So it is also in line with our data that most of the firms declare net zero at the more later stage. And before we go to the empirical estimations, we are going to see when would the firm declare net zero. So we run the following regression equations. D, I, T, and Z. So this is dummy variable. So it is equal to a nonlinear function to use the probit and logic regressions with respect to the emissions and other control variables. And this is the estimation result. So it can be seen that when firms declare net zero, they are usually the low emitters. So that means the most high emitting firms, they usually avoid this committing to net zeros. And they are usually larger size, smaller leverage. They have a larger fixed assets and capital investment. They are also the value stock. So all this shows that for firm declare net zero, it seems that they are more mature. So they are less focusing on the short-term profit. They are not in the stage of sharply increasing their profits. So next we will start our analysis to analyze the carbon risk premium. So empirical estimations. The first part we want to show whether there's existence of carbon risk premium in the equity market. And we will run the following regression return with respect to the emission intensities and a vector of control variables. So here, alpha 1 would be the carbon risk premium because it measures the marginal impact of the GHG intensity with respect to the firm returns in the next period. And this is the estimation result. So it shows that there's a positive carbon risk premium with respect to GHG intensities. So a 1% increase in firm level GHG intensity would lead to a 14 basis point increase in the stock return monthly. That means 1.7 annualized increase in stock price. So these findings is in line with literature that there is a positive carbon risk premium. And next, we will introduce our net zero commitment. So to see whether net zero commitment can affect the carbon risk premium, we introduce a dummy variable and we interact with the log GHG intensity. So now, the carbon risk premium will become alpha 1 plus alpha 3 multiplied by the dummy variable of net zero. So to see whether the carbon risk net zero commitment could affect the carbon risk premium, the coefficient of interest will be alpha 3. So these are the estimation results. So if we use all the data, on average, it can be seen that the increase in carbon risk premium is insignificant. So that means on average, net zero commitment would bring no impact on the size of carbon risk premium. And this result is not surprising because in our theoretical framework, we have already shown that net zero commitment can affect carbon risk premium in both directions. So to further understand the behavior, we slice and dice the samples. First is the transition capacities. So again, as mentioned, transition capacity we measure by the country level energy use per capita and the share of renewable electricity output. So first of all, for the firms with high transition capacity, that means they have lower the medians of energy use per capita and the higher of the median share of renewable electricity output. It can be seen that the carbon risk premium significant is lowered by the net zero commitments. And for the column 2 and 4, they are the firms with energy use per capita higher than the median, and the share of renewable electricity is lower the median. So this means for the firms with low transition capacity, it can be seen that the interaction term is positively significant. That means after the firm declare net zero, their carbon risk premium is going to increase. So it shows that investors perceive that this is actually a bad signal if they declare net zero. And next is the transition urgencies. So column 1 and 3 are the firms with high transition urgencies because it has a higher than median score of the policy-driven CO2 emissions. And column 3 represents the firms located at country with more ambitious carbon pricing policies. So this shows that if the firms located at the high transition urgencies, after they declare net zero, the carbon risk premium is going to decrease. And in opposite, for firms with low transition urgencies, the carbon risk premium is going to increase after the firm declares net zero. And finally is the decision horizons. So column 1 and 3 measures the firms with the median environmental pillar score and without golden parachutes. That means these firms can capture the long-term investors with a smaller discount rate. So it could be seen that firm with long-termism investor could record a lower carbon risk premium after their net zero commitment. And the opposite is with the firms with more short-term horizons. After they declare net zero, they could record a high carbon risk premium. So this shows that net zero commitment can have a different size, can increase or decrease the carbon risk premium. It depends on transition readiness. It measured by the transition capacity, urgencies, and decision horizons. But what actually driving the carbon risk premium in the equity market? So next, we are going to investigate what are the driving trend of the net zero commitment of the carbon risk premium in the equity market. And one explanation is the institutional investors. So institutional investor has the biggest pot of money. So this is very crucial in achieving the low carbon emissions, low carbon transition in the world. So the literature also shows that institutional investors, they would divest from firms who have high emission intensity. So we hypothesize that institutional investors actually would price the net zero commitment in the carbon risk premium in the financial market. So we estimate the regression equations. We run the regression with respect to IO, with respect to GG intensity and other net zero dummy variable, as well as the interaction terms. And here, IOIT here stand for the percentage of share owned by institutional investors at time t. And this is the estimation result. Column 1, we intended to drop, not to include the dummy variable net zero in the interaction term. It shows that in general, institutional investors would divest from firms who have higher GHG intensity. And this finding is in line with literatures. And column 2, if we add the dummy variable and the interaction term, it shows that institutional investors would even divest more if the firms has declared net zero, facing a higher GHG intensities. And we conduct further analysis. We exclude the salient industries. It shows that the divestment results remain unchanged. That means the divestment of institutional investors are not just constrained at the high emitting industries. So they will divest across all the other industries. And further analysis is that if we break down the institutional ownership by 4 quarters, so column 1 and column 2 are the quarters of are the observation of firms that has smaller institutional ownership. So the interaction term shows that actually the firm declaring net zero has no impact of the carbon risk premium. But if the relative importance of institutional investor increase, say in columns 3 and column 4, in which the institutional investor play a more important role, when the firm declares net zero, the institutional investor would demand for a higher carbon risk premium. So All this evidence shows that institutional investors play a very important role in pricing the carbon risk premium in the market. To conclude, we show that net zero commitment can actually affect carbon risk premium in either direction. It depends on the firm level of transition readiness. And we also show that institutional investors are very important in pricing this carbon risk premium, and they would divest even more if the firms have declared net zero. And our findings shows very important policy implication for policymakers. So policymakers have to implement policies to increase the firm transition readiness. On the one hand, this can avoid the building of carbon risk premium, as carbon risk premium can lead to a very sharp price volatility in the financial market, and also to foster a low carbon transitions. If they can increase the transition readiness, more and more firms will be incentivized to declare net zero commitment, and this can help the globe to achieve a low carbon transitions.
Okay, so that's the end of our presentation. We welcome your comments and feedback or questions.
Great. Great. Thanks both Keith and Wilson. So as we gather some questions, I had one for you myself. So I was thinking while you were going the theoretical framework, it's very nice in clarifying the importance of both capacity and ambition for the effect on enterprise value. So I'm wondering about sort of out of sample validation of your theory. And kind of here's the test I have in mind. Are you sort of able to predict who would and who wouldn't declare a net zero commitment? So if I look back in your sample and out of your sample as well, given you have information on the variables of your theory, how do you think you would do on that? Not just within your sample, I mean, both outside and in, because you collected based on, yeah, who's declaring net zero, right?
Right. So our key analysis focusing on after the firm declared net zero, what is the change in the pricing behavior? So
right.
we have not conducted in details what kind of firms would declare or not. So we just have a very preliminary data, some preliminary fixed effect estimations in this slide in particular to show that what kind of firms they are more likely to declare net zero. So based on our empirical estimation, we basically find that for firms declaring net zero, they are relatively more mature. They are less focusing on profit because it shows that say ROE, momentum, and volatility. These are actually for firms that are less mature. They are focusing on profit maximizations. So these kind of firms are less likely to declare net zero.
Yeah, and also the observation unit here is IT, which means that in some sense, the table here that we present is capturing also the timing of declaring net zero. Okay, so we look at the companies that declare net zero by 2022, and here the variables, of course, a lot of them are time varying, and is showing a correlation here with the timing of declaring net zero when companies have a small leverage and when they have become a lower emitters. So I think we don't have the data looking beyond the sample here, but I believe this kind of test we can conduct maybe after collecting more sample.
Yeah, I mean, it would be interesting to know if anyone's done that kind of analysis, whether, say, greenhouse gas emission intensity actually predicts whether firms will declare net zero or not. Because you can see just very basic rationale that if I'm super exposed, I'm a coal mining company, I'm very unlikely to try and have a net zero ambition. Whereas a bank, for example, that can source through renewable electricity and doesn't have that much carbon intensity might be tempted to do that. So it'd be interesting to know.
Yeah, actually, it's a very interesting question to explore, especially recently, many companies have pulled out from SBTi. So previously they declared net zero, and now they say that they don't want to honor the promise anymore. So I
Right.
think looking at the timing, why people pull out from net zero, whether they have to do with some environmental factors will be a very interesting question to explore.
Right. So let me start taking questions from the chat. We've got two here from Pascal Wheel. I'll just ask both of them. First, are you taking into account dividends in your equity return or only the stock price? And does an increase in stock price equate to a lower expected future return?
The short answer is that both are yes. So we use the price after taking into account the dividends and the increase in stock price. Yes.
Okay, well, that's easy. So then I'll move to Rajashi Das, who is curious about strategic signaling, perhaps with game theoretic analysis, where multiple firms are competing for finite amounts of investment from institutional investors in terms of the decision variables firms can control.
Yeah, so I think there are many interesting game theoretical questions one can pose on this problem. One thing that some of my colleagues have brought to my attention is, well, perhaps sometimes if you are located in an industry that is highly concentrated, for example, you're operating in the same market and there are only a few companies, and despite your high emission intensity, maybe there's a possibility that the companies can collude together and not commit to net zero. Okay, so when they do that collectively, they don't declare net zero. Collectively, they are really slow in decarbonization. That can actually increase the pressure for the government not to raise the regulatory stringency because if the company in the market are predominantly not moving and the government is also going to suffer or incur a higher cost of transition. So this kind of strategic dynamics are very important to consider, like especially recently, many companies are pulling out from the the net zero alliances, and one can argue that this is sending a signal to the government that maybe they cannot it's going to incur a high cost if companies are not supporting your initiative. Okay, so the ideal scenario for government to see is that once you introduce a policy, companies start to react really quickly and reduce the friction of the policy implementation. Okay, so this is one strategic dynamics that we can think of. As for the one that you specifically refer to, okay, what about companies competing for finite amount of investment from institutional investors? Okay, so I think it really depends on, first of all, what kind of institutional investors we are talking about. So some of the institutional investors, they're not interested in the long run. So we have got hedge fund as an example. Some of them are more into the longer run. But second of all would be, well, how do they compete for this investment? Do they do it by genuinely going green, or are they actually, in some sense, implicitly colluding with the institutional investors who basically just want to satisfy the green mandate? So a company, Bruce and I are working on a paper where institutional investors tend to invest in companies with low emission intensity, but they are not necessarily the one that are paying the most effort in decarbonization. Okay, so these will be the companies that issue climate bonds with an explicit promise to decarbonize, but when you look at the environmental expenditure, that's not the case. So are these the companies that are worth the most financial support? This is a very important question that raised the attention of GFANZ recently. That GFANZ actually released a consultation paper a few months ago talking about the difference between decarbonization in the real economy versus portfolio decarbonization. So if investors, they have the objective of just decarbonizing the portfolio, it's easy to just make the portfolio clean by divesting from all these brown firms. But what about the companies that actually need the money to do the transition? So I think in thinking about this strategic dynamics, so many aspects can be brought into the model. So that is a very interesting field for research.
Great. Now, would any of the panelists like to unmute themselves and ask a question? Or if not, anyone else can raise their hand and I'll unmute you.
Oh, hello.
Hello.
Yeah, thank you very much for a nice and insightful presentation. I have shared 2 questions with Connor. Should I just share those
Yeah, go ahead.
questions?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, the first one is about form fixed effects. How would you explain the omission of form fixed effects, which could raise any bias in the results? And the second one is about what if the institutional investors themselves are green or they are committed as well? So could there be different results if both the firms and the investors are committed? So how could that interact the results? Thank you.
First one is on the bias, sorry. So can you repeat
Yes.
the effect that you
The
talk
first one is
about?
about firm fixed effects in the
Oh, firm fixed
model.
effect.
Yeah.
To be honest, we did not try any estimation based on firm fixed effect because most we look at the literature, they basically introduce industry and country fixed effect. So of course we can take a look at the firm fixed effect later to see whether the result is result change or not. And the second question is about green commit. Yeah, I think I cannot hear your second questions clearly.
Yeah, the second one is about what if the investors themselves are green or they are committed as well. So there is possibility of in the SBTI, some of the investors, institutional investors themselves could be net zero committed.
Oh, you mean on one hand we're looking at institutional investors
As a whole.
how they change the ownership, but are these investors also part of our sample? So
yeah, again we have not collected data, so we don't have detailed breakdown of the institutional investors. So unfortunately, we want to try, but we find it difficult.
No, I think the question is not whether we break down different types of institutional investors, but whether the companies that declare net zero include the financial institutions. And
No, the first one. I mean the first one.
Oh, okay, sorry.
Yeah.
All right.
Great. And we have one more here from Berna Yilmaz. I'll take you in a sec, Yasmin. Let me just read out Berna's question. Just looking at the fact that institutional investors divest more from high emission firms that declare net zero commitments, could this imply that investors perceive these firms as engaging in greenwashing? Have you examined whether firms that declare net zero commitments also show actual reductions in emissions over time? So is this just, cheap talk, let's say?
Yeah, okay. I think this is a very interesting and important question. So we actually, at first, before we build a model, we think that maybe the result does not need building any model because we can just use cheap talk to talk about the differential. However, if we look at the result here, we observe something that cannot just be explained by cheap talk. So let me go to the result here. Okay, so basically, if it's just a matter of cheap talk, then we would only observe the effect in one direction. So for example, okay, declaring net zero is going to reduce the carbon risk premium, but if I don't believe that you can do it, if I don't believe that you do it, then perhaps it will just be insignificant or smaller in magnitude, but in the same direction. But what we show here is that actually it cannot just be explained by cheap talk because the direction actually goes the other way, and the results are statistically significant in both ways. Okay, so this is actually prompting us to think about a better explanation, which is not just about the credibility of the commitment. As a result, we construct a theoretical model which is able to capture the direction in the effect in both directions. So sometimes in certain conditions, declaring net zero is going to raise your enterprise value and also to reduce the carbon risk premium. But sometimes it will go the opposite direction. So declaring net zero will be perceived as suboptimal given that you have a low transition readiness and the investor believe that you will do it. So we don't preclude the possibility that both results are present at the same time. So there may be some element of cheap talk, but cheap talk alone cannot explain why the direction of the result are opposite, depending on the like which part of the subsample you're looking at. Okay, so we'll argue that this empirical result shows that at least the channel that we propose in the model is present. Otherwise, chip talk alone cannot explain the opposite directions in the results.
Okay, great.
So,
I wanna leave time for Yasmin's last questions. Yasmin, go ahead.
Yeah, so it's actually also related to in the cheap talk, but what I was more wondering about is not per se the directions of the effect, but the response of the institutional investors, because the fact that they divest from firms that are actually declaring net zero commitments at least seems to indicate that either they don't buy it that the firms actually make net zero commitments, or they just don't care about it. And one thing that I was wondering is whether you would be able to maybe split up your sample based on the moment in time that Trump withdrew the first time from the Paris Agreement, to see whether that's then maybe a signal that these institutional investors actually act upon to just, like not care about the net zero commitments anymore in any case, or whether there's something else going on, because it's actually the response of the institutional investors that surprises me somewhat here, and that I still find hard to reconcile, to really find or think about what is going on there or what's driving their behavior.
So yes, there are lots of possible explanation, but what we want to say is that after the firm they declare net zero, this gives a signal to investor that they are actually going to take actions. So if a firms have a higher GHG intensity, it automatically means that they have to pay a larger and larger abatement cost. So that's why we can find a negative interaction terms. And for the Trump sample, yeah, we can go to C, but the problem is that I remember the Trump's exit of Paris Agreement is about 2016 or 2017. I'm afraid that there are very few firms they have declared net zero, but we will see. We can see.
You will have more data soon, maybe. So
Certainly true.
yeah, another event study.
Right. Well, that's about all we've got time for. So how about we wrap it up there? So thanks very much to both our authors for that fascinating presentation. Our next webinar will take place on March 24th. Tristan Jord and Quentin Moreau will present their research on systemic climate risk. I'm going to share the link to that in the chat window. Thanks so much, everyone, for joining us, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.